Hi, I'm Sarah Miller. I'm the Vice Chair of the Emerging Technology Caucus here in the Crisis Technology Center in booth 205. And I'm pleased to introduce Alisha Griswold, who will be giving a tech talk on cybersecurity.
Thanks, Sarah. Hey, everyone. I'm the founder and inaugural chair of the Emerging Technology Caucus. I do a lot of work out of King County, Washington, that deals with cybersecurity. So we're going to talk about cybersecurity today. All right, so what to you guys is cybersecurity? What does cybersecurity mean to you? It's kind of what hackers do on computers. They break your stuff. They get into things that they're not supposed to. So for today's purposes, we're going to talk about cybersecurity as if it's almost like medicine, almost like a series of behaviors, treatment, and outcomes. It's not necessarily a standalone behavior or a standalone outcome. It's really a very holistic process. In totems, cybersecurity is always a balance between security, or making sure that people cannot access things unauthorized, and privacy and accessibility. I've seen some companies do creative things like glue their USB ports shut so their employees find creative ways of either re-putting them open or plugging in a remote hardware. They always find creative workarounds. They start emailing each other programs or slide decks. They start exchanging things on CDs and using more either advanced technology or remote technology to basically complete the work that they're trying to do on their daily basis without necessarily interruption. So the harder you make it for employees and clients to conduct work, the more likely you are to force them to do workarounds. So if you understand the work they're trying to conduct, you can give them access to the tools and the data and the systems that they're trying to use while making sure that they stay secure on the internet. So in general, for today's purposes, hackers are not necessarily going to be your enemy. A hacker is going to be defined as somebody who finds an alternative use for something. You can put unauthorized programs on a graphing calculator. That's considered technically hacking under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. You can try to improve the battery function or performance of an electric vehicle. That would be considered hacking, again, under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. We're not going to prosecute those or judge those behaviors today. We're really just going to look at criminal activity. So the public is not necessarily your enemy. Those who conduct hardware hacking or try to improve physical objects are not your enemy. Criminals are your enemy for today's purposes. And certainly regulatory agencies are not your enemy. You have to work with those guys. When in doubt, I highly recommend you utilize the materials from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. The EFF has really amazing lawyers standing by. They do a lot of work that basically takes very advanced pieces of legislation and breaks it down into plain language for community members. So if you're an agency and you're wondering, gee, should I tell people that it's not possible for them to talk about their job on social media, which is a violation of the First Amendment, especially if they're on their own time, there are certain ways that you can safeguard your data and information while making sure that you maintain civil liberties and support freedom of speech. And the Electronic Frontier Foundation will break down some of those very complex technical topics and basically tell you how they apply to your particular agency, jurisdiction, or private company. One of my personal technological heroes, this is Bruce Schneier. He runs a really awesome blog called Schneier and Security. I highly recommend it. Again, he's taking really advanced concepts and breaking them down. I'm particularly fond of his use of biological models to formally represent things like threat escalation. So he uses a really great acronym or metric for showing you how threats escalate based on rabbits and ferrets. So the rabbits are so fast, and when ferrets get just as fast, the rabbit population drops. So the rabbits have to get faster. They evolve to be faster. The faster rabbits survive. You can use a similar model to understand how people attack specific systems. If you force them to be too locked down, meaning you're no longer observing particular low-level threats, you actually force threat escalation. So Bruce does a really great job, and again, explaining some of those advanced cybersecurity concepts, using some very great metaphors that we understand, like biology and animals. Does a really good job of explaining those in plain English for individuals that are not necessarily part of the cybersecurity community. Some examples of how you can become compromised. Of course, data compromise is one of our biggest concerns. If you deal with things like HIPAA or FERPA, those are fun acronyms, and basically what they mean are personally identifying pieces of information. That can be medical data, information on credit cards or grades, your student information. Chances are your agency works with HIPAA or FERPA on some level. You can also have protected critical infrastructure information, which is PCII, that deals primarily with a lot of your communication systems, your technologies that deal with the utility sector or transportation. Those are the primary three for critical infrastructure. Malicious code can be injected into your system in a variety of different ways. Traditionally, we've seen a lot of injection of code through things like phishing schemes, which basically spoof an email for you to click and enter information that's sensitive. That could be passwords, that could be particular types of systems that you have, even things like employee names, can be leveraged through social engineering to gain tiered access to particular systems that people are not supposed to necessarily have. You can think of hacking as things that are not necessarily bad behaviors, but individuals that are trying to get access to stuff, not necessarily you're trying to grant them to. Criminals are usually interested in grabbing hold of pieces of information, selling them on the black market, or gathering things like intellectual property and stealing ideas to manufacture them in another country. Foreign military departments are doing this too. We're not talking about children in basements today. These are really trained professionals. One of the biggest issues that I find are free devices. Free devices are usually loaded with fun, interesting things. One of my favorite stories is from a fellow cybersecurity specialist, our chief information security officer for one of my utilities and special municipality districts in the Seattle area. She went to a security conference and was given a free flash drive. Lo and behold, the free flash drive was infected with malicious software. So she actually supported a cyber attack accidentally by taking this flash drive and plugging it in, realized that it was infected, and of course everyone enjoyed the sweet irony of the situation where you got an infected flash drive from a security conference. Be very careful of free iPads. Free is not necessarily free. Whatever device somebody's giving you, please make sure you're doing robust screening of the software that comes loaded on that. My mother loves those digital picture frames that everybody seems to enjoy. They're great, but the way that you load a digital picture frame is you either plug it directly into your computer or you go back and forth with a flash drive. Again, whatever that flash drive touches after your photo frame can be highly infected. Your enemy is well trained. Criminals we're not talking about kids in basements necessarily or skiddies. They're kind of on the low end of threats these days. We're actually talking about individuals that are highly trained. So you can look at trolls. Trolls might be part of a decentralized organization. I will not name names because I don't like being attacked on the open internet, and this is a live feed. But seriously, there are lots of organizations out there that would like to attack your stuff for a variety of different reasons. We're talking about trained military departments and individuals with a lot of time and a lot of savvy. Really not necessarily about individuals that are doing low-level attacks at this point. If you are an emergency manager, the good news is there's a lot that you can do to address cybersecurity threats. You can work with IT and your chief information security officer to make recovery plans. At this point, you can think of cybersecurity as a public health policy. What I'm referring to today, sir, is digital chlamydia. There you go. You didn't think we were going to talk about chlamydia today? Yes, we are. Okay, so well, I'm trying to protect everyone from digital chlamydia. You do not necessarily have to know, all of the details of what chlamydia does, but you should at least be honest with people and tell them what it looks like. So instead of treating your end users as if they're too dumb and they're constantly going to be getting chlamydia, please tell them what chlamydia looks like. Or internet chlamydia, ma'am. Internet chlamydia, if you're not literal chlamydia. Sorry, Kevin. Okay, there we go. Anyway, back to our public health analogy. We're trying to clean up the internet and these devices by letting front-end users know what these infections look like. The more they understand what cybersecurity infections look like, the better they can do to actually tell IT that there's a problem with their system. So instead of telling front-end users that they're too dumb to understand infections, empower them to be your first trip line and your tripwire to let you know that you've been attacked or that your company's been compromised. The additional roles of emergency management: identify resources in advance. When I get to cyber insurance, which is really all over the board at this point, cyber insurance is a variety of different ways of protecting your system, primarily because they provide resources to respond and recover from a particular attack or a data breach. A lot of times these are attached to companies that deal with credit card data, or again, that HIPAA and FERPA information that incurs a federal fee if it has been compromised. We support education and outreach. Obviously, if you're going out into your community and talking to them about cybersecurity issues, make sure that, again, you're doing it in a humane way that is not necessarily triggering fear. I could stand up here all day and talk about the threat landscape and how scary this is, but rather than do that, I'd I'd much rather empower you with things you can do through your continuity of operations plans, working with local emergency management or your information and analysis centers, things that you can actually do on a daily basis to protect yourself, rather than having you walk away from this particular talk afraid. So I won't show the Stuxnet and Aurora Generator test videos, but I highly recommend that you look them up. Stuxnet by Antibody is a great video that explains the dichotomy and analysis of the Stuxnet virus, how it attacked the Natanz Iranian uranium enrichment facility. That's kind of a mouthful. Basically, it caused centrifuges to spin too quickly. But while the centrifuges were spinning too quickly and basically burning themselves out, the dashboards that the engineers were seeing viewed everything as normal. So it would almost be like driving a car and all of a sudden you could hear the engine rev up, but your dashboard, your dashboard and console on your car says that everything's normal. It's not overheating, yet you see smoke coming out of the engine, right? So what the engineers were physically seeing, what was happening to the equipment, was not being registered correctly on the dashboard. It's a very complex piece of code. And did I mention that this is on the open internet? So it's basically an open source cyber weapon. Anybody can take Stuxnet and retool it and fire it right back at the people who started it. And chances are that was us in Israel at this point. The Aurora Generator test conducted by the Idaho National Laboratories, they were looking at ways that cybersecurity weapons could be basically aimed at critical infrastructure. Could you find ways, not just utilizing specific pieces of code, to attack generators and cause them to burn out? And the answer is yes. I highly recommend that you check this video out as well. It's very disturbing. Basically, they take a large several-ton generator, inject some malicious code so it burns itself out, and basically it catches on fire. It starts shaking at one point, and pieces are flying off in all different directions. We really have a sensitive power grid. There are components of our U.S. power grid that are so sensitive that if you took out as many as 9 or as few as 3 transfer stations and switches throughout the United States, you could actually do massive damage and power outages through several different states at a time, if not across the entire nation. So when I talk about attacks against critical infrastructure, it's vitally important to recognize the interdependencies on these particular types of equipment, their software systems, and of course, service providers. Shoten is pretty entertaining. So Shoten is basically like Google for things that should never be on the internet. Shoten. You can check this out at https ICS, that's industrial control system.shoten.io, and it will show you a radar system. It's kind of a neat animated feature. So for Shoten, all of the buttons respond to different pieces of components that should never be on the internet. And I say they shouldn't be on the internet because they're things like unsecured CCTV cameras. So like unsecured traffic cameras in Russia, power plants in Ukraine, dishwashers in Maine, like anything that's on the internet and connected to Wi-Fi, Nest systems that are not secured, home HVAC systems, stuff that really should be locked down, that doesn't have good password and access, ends up on Shoten. And every single little point of light that you see is a compromised system that you can click on and open up and actually view whatever that critical infrastructure information is on. So you can actually look into, not that I would do this because hello, Homeland Security, I enjoy your money. I love being gainfully employed, and I always stop short of that line where it says hacking and educational purposes. Very educational, very not criminal activity from Alisha at this point. Yes, 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 very educational. Each single one of these, it will actually turn around and spin and show you all the different like honeypots and different access systems that you've got. So you can actually explore Shoten for completely educational purposes, non-malicious purposes on your own. The Internet of Things that I referenced, that a lot of those materials are online right now, include a lot of the things that are running our home. Amazon has actually launched Amazon Dash, which are these little plastic buttons that you can push and order toilet paper. I'm just waiting for someone to hack into someone's home and on their unsecured Wi-Fi and order them like 4 tons of toilet paper. Like anything can actually happen on these particular systems if they're not locked down and secured. No, actually, I think my power died. It's plugged in here, but is this plugged in?
Yeah, it should be.
Is that fully plugged in?
All right.
We were not hacked. My laptop power died. Yeah, that's the thanks, NSA. No, I'm just kidding. I have fingerprints on file with the FBI, so hopefully they know who my allegiances go to at this point. So there's lots of ways that emergency managers can continue to address this with their local communities. One of the recommendations I have is to weave cybersecurity concepts into your continuity of operations plans, which is really not that hard to do. If you've ever written COOP plans before, you know that they're very template-based. So continuity of operations plans have things in them like lines of succession, delegated authorities, correct? Lists of contacts and vendors. If you add into your COOP plans your essential systems, so you identify what work has to be completed by each individual work group, what systems they are dependent upon to complete that work, you can actually start triaging restoration times in systems for restoration if you have an outage. What's really interesting about doing that is it works whether or not you have a power bump. I've actually worked, when I was with the Port of Seattle, we had a lightning strike that took a lot of our systems offline. It wasn't necessarily a malicious attack, it was actually just lightning from nature that came down and zapped one of our systems and caused them to fail over to backup systems, and a lot of things went down. We took that real world scenario and actually tabletopped it out, and from that we came up with policies that help further safeguard our systems. For example, one of the rules that we came up with is thou shalt not take off systems for restoration and maintenance within a 10-mile lightning strike zone. So if the National Weather Service says there's lightning within 10 miles of the port, we no longer take systems offline for basic maintenance, right? There's other ways of completing that work. In addition, we can start identifying those essential systems for restoration. We know which ones fail over manually and which ones fail over automated. What you might discover when you start to do this business impact analysis is that a lot of those systems aren't as high of a pain point threshold as you thought. For example, the current county that I work with, King County, I can honestly say that payroll is not our bleeding priority. Sorry, King County employees, I'm not saying that you won't get paid. I'm saying that our payroll system, if it fails over to a system very naturally. So that's actually not our concern, our primary concern for restoration. If I had to look at all of our systems, knowing who's in the jail, that's a bit of a higher priority than people having to pick up their paper checks. Knowing who's mobile data terminals and law enforcement vehicles, that would be a higher priority. People's medical records for public health meetings, that would be a higher priority. A lot of those records, again, are federally regulated and require notification to individuals or families if their data has been compromised. And a lot of those systems also come with fees if you have a compromise. So you're highly incentivized to, there we go, Internet of Things. You're highly incentivized to make sure that you don't have a compromise, that your systems are secure. And if you think cyber insurance is going to save you, think again. We actually had to use ours recently when we had CryptoLocker, that's ransomware, in our GIS servers. When we called in the insurance company to do their investigation, they didn't give us as much information as the Intelligence Analysis Center that was doing more specific analysis through the fusion centers as well. That information came to us a couple weeks later, unfortunately. So speeding up response and recovery is ideal. Unfortunately, we're still looking at cyber response teams to do this. Cyber resilience project management looks a lot like the THIRA, that's the threat hazard identification risk assessment that emergency managers go through. So if you're looking at things like business impact analysis, you can do this very simply. And if you are an emergency manager, I highly recommend that you recognize that this kind of breaks the Stafford Act. When I say it breaks the Stafford Act, it doesn't actually hurt the legislation itself. It breaks the processes that we're accustomed to for getting disaster declarations. A disaster declaration is always signed off by the governor of a state, and then it goes to the president of the United States. Right now, there's no precedent for using a cyber incident and declaring a disaster. However, good news, state of Washington, we're excited to announce that we just completed cybersecurity that are NIMS typed response teams. So just like you have search and rescue, just like you have incident management teams, the state of Washington is now rolling out cyber incident response teams. That is an open source project, and we're happy to share our templates with you. It's a bit of a digital forensics paradox for most emergency managers if you're not accustomed to working with cyber incidents. What's really interesting about this is if people don't know that funds are coming to support response and recovery, they oftentimes do not participate in digital forensics. So if they're just wiping systems and restoring them without understanding what happened, chances are you're open to the same vulnerability again, and you're not actually able to participate appropriately in mitigation behaviors. One reason you should care about this is the largest wildfire in Washington state history, the Carlton Complex fire. It burned an area 5 times the size of the city of Seattle. That's an enormous, 250,000 acres were actually destroyed. Multiple zones, incident management teams, multiple mesh networks were popped up to support response. What was really interesting about this, mesh networks are ad hoc, so they don't actually, well, at least the mesh networks we were using for this particular response, they were ad hoc, so they did not exist before the fire. We were actually seeing malicious attacks against first responder networks during the wildfire. So people were actually seeking out a brand new network to attack it, understanding that it was supporting wildfire response. So again, if you think cybersecurity is IT's issue, think again. It's a public health issue. It's available for everyone. The flu is not just public health's problem, it's every individual's problem. So if we're not addressing cybersecurity holistically, we're missing a lot of things that we could do to keep ourselves safe. Some additional pieces of education. Sorry, I think that slide's a little a little messed up there. OnGuardOnline.gov does free education and outreach. You can actually get your staff and employees to participate in things like the phishing game. They can go look at spoofed emails and try and pick out which ones are real. Other things you can do is your own penetration testing. You can scatter around dirty flash drives and see who plugs it in. And they say that they won a prize. Maybe it's got a piece of pop-up, not malicious code again. This is your team doing red team testing. Maybe a piece of software pops up on the screen and says, congratulations, you won a prize. And that prize is usually a free conversation with IT about why we don't plug in unknown flash drives. Maybe sweeten the pot with a Starbucks. Recently, I've talked to some penetration teams that do a really good job, and they've got their employees so well trained that they're actually disappointed when their penetration testing fails. They're actually disappointed when they don't get to have that conversation because they're like, oh, these guys are getting so good. So just again, like all those other conversations that we've had about preventative behaviors, you can make sure that you're working with your teams to do that front-end education and outreach. Kaspersky Labs does a great job of representing data sets visually. So if you're trying to make this tangible to individuals that don't necessarily understand computer science stuff, I highly recommend their posters. They have a lot of stuff available for free. That's again Kaspersky Labs, a lot of visuals that you can take and use. This month, happy Cyber Awareness Month, everyone. I hope you're celebrating accordingly. I know I have been. So things that are coming up next for us, I mentioned our cyber response teams in the state of Washington. Again, we'll be doing a full presentation on that tomorrow. I believe we're at 2 o'clock or so. We're the session that's not quite immediately after lunch. We're the one after that. Additional cybersecurity questions. Again, Alisha Griswold with King County Emergency Management. I'm happy to talk to you. Additional information that's going to be coming in, again, this is a thyroid core capability. So if you're a United States emergency manager, you're required to plan for cybersecurity. You guys can totally do this. Get credit for what you're already doing. Use those continuity of operations plans. Work with IT and make sure that you have a holistic strategy. Empower your front-end users to be tripwires in your lines of defense against attack. You can do this. We can do this. We can make it safer together. Thank you so much.